Um, yeah, I mean, we'll definitely have to do some philosophy this time, because I don't think we just want to do all hagiography. Did you want to have like all hagiography of Nagarjuna? No. I got the impression from some of the questions after lunch that that was not the main motivation. Well, some of, as you know, some of Nagarjuna's most important works, just as a brief overview, and then we'll get into the middle way, are divided into these three groups, roughly the, you could say, collections of praise, collections of advice, and collections of reasoning. Sometimes people say like that. So the 6 collections, so let's just say for a second, collections of reasoning, Riksok in Tibetan, is usually numbered 6, but sometimes is numbered 5. And it includes, for sure, the, what do you say, Treatise on the Middle Way, or Root Verses on the Madhyamaka, variously titled. The Prajna Mula, or Mula Madhyamaka Karika in Sanskrit, Umad Zawa Sherap in Tibetan. So that's the text for which Tsongkhapa is most famous. And then you have the refutation of objections, Vigraha Vyavartani, which I have never heard anybody dispute. That was authored also by Nagarjuna. 70 stanzas on emptiness, and 60 verses of reasoning. So that's 4. Then in addition, there's a text called in people translating from the Tibetan usually call it the finely woven. From what I've been reading this week, it seems like it might be better to translate the title as the pulverizing treatise, or the pulverizing sutra even. It's okay, so why can something be translated finely woven, and then I'm saying maybe it's supposed to be pulverizing? Because the word finely woven in Tibetan is, shipmo is finely, and then namtak is being translated woven by Jeffrey and many other people, but it also means like to mill or to grind. And when you look at the Sanskrit and what is actually happening in the treatise, it seems like this is not about weaving together an argument so much as smashing other people's categories to smithereens. That seems to be the purport of the title. You could say something like smashing to smithereens, but that sounds maybe a little informal. But that's what it's something. So some people actually do call, I'm not making up pulverizing, that is, some people actually call it that. And just as of this moment, I'm inclined to think that that might be the better translation. So then we have that. That makes 5. So how do we get to 6? All of those, well, some people have raised questions about whether that last one, some Western scholars have raised questions about whether that last one is stylistically up to the standards that you would expect of Nagarjuna's writing, and whether it has some distinctive characteristics of his writing. But generally speaking, with some objections, people accept those. Then to make from 5 to 6, many people add the precious garland, but not everybody does. Some people just stop with 5. It seems in His Holiness's teachings, he usually talks about 6. If you read closely in the and he counts the precious garland as the 6th. If you read closely in the reading that we're talking about for today, you see that when His Holiness is giving commentary on a certain verse, he said, well, I've had text transmissions on this from 2 people, and one gave me on 6 of the texts and one on 5. You look at the footnote, and Jimba says, well, the one that he didn't get on from one of his lamas was Precious Garland, presumably because that teacher hadn't considered that to be part of the Rikzok in that tradition. So some people do count 5 in Tibet, and some people count 6. And one of the things about counting, I mean, the Precious Garland is a complex text because it includes some mature reasoning about emptiness, but it's also embedded in a much bigger context that gives advice about the important reasons not to gamble, and then advice about how to cultivate merit, and how to rely, if you're a king, on your ministers for good advice if it helps the people, and not just to ignore them. And it gives advice about all different kinds of things, and emptiness arguments within that context. So when they make up these categories, whether to count that as a collection of advice or a collection of reasoning, it's clear that people have reached different conclusions. Like, a lot of people want to put it together with the friendly letter because they both seem to be framed as letters to the king. We don't know the exact name of that king. Everybody disagrees about the exact name. But this Satavahana king that he was friends with, he may have written both these letters, some people to that same king. He wrote 2 letters to a king, so it may have been the same king. So anyway, that is either in or out of that class. And then there's some people who count 6 without including the Precious Garland, by including a different text, which in Tibetan is Tanya Dhruva, basically. It's Vyavahara Siddhi in Sanskrit. It means like conventional establishment or conventional existence is the name of the text. And it's lost except for 6 verses. And so those 6 verses, well, we can read them, not this minute, but it's very, very short. Basically, he talks about how a mantra, he takes a mantra as an example of something existing conventionally in relationship to the different syllables, and not either being found either in the individual syllables or in the group of syllables and so forth. So, and that's just 6 verses. So, okay, so that's the 7 texts that are counted as either the 5 or the 6 collections of reasoning. I just thought I would say these things because it's confusing to me. I don't know. It's like you really see people talk about that and say, well, what are the 6? And then you see one thing and then somebody else talks about the 5, or they put a different one in. And so anyway, that's how I've gotten this sorted out so far. Then the collections of advice, so people will usually include in their Sutra Samuchaya, which is an anthology of Mahayana Sutra passages. So, and it's very frequently resorted to in Tibetan, so that people have like all these pithy sutra passages excerpted from different Mahayana sutras. See, the same thing would be very popular today, right? It's like, right, the best of the Mahayana sutras, and sort of like Nagarjuna did a text like that, so that's very popular. And then, of course, Suhrilika or Shebe Tinyik, the letter to a friend or friendly letter, which is a sort of a non-emptiness related a letter of advice to his friend the king. And then often people put Bodhicitta Vivarana in here, or what is I guess you'd say commentary on Bodhicitta, although as Venerable Chandrana and I were alluding to the other day, it includes a philosophical a critique of Chittamatra. So it seems, since the Chittamatra had not, as far as we know, arisen in the world when Nagarjuna was alive, it seems like questionable whether he would have also authored a critique of it. So anyway, that's usually included in there. And then Then there's a class in Sanskrit called the Chatushtava, the 4 hymns or 4 collections, the collection of 4 praises. They're like, well, you know, the kind of poetry that you get, like when you're exalting something at the beginning and an end of a text, all right? You know, celebrating the Buddha for wonderful qualities and something like that. Well, these are whole texts that are not, you know, not treatises, but they're songs or poems of celebration. One of the difficulties is that people always speak about them as 4, but there's like different lists of 4. And so anyway, I mean, one of the most often quoted one is the praise to the sphere of reality, or however you would translate Dharma Dhatu. There's a praise to the ultimate truth, a praise to the supermundane, a praise to the incomparable, and this is these and there's about, I don't know, 6 or 7, and then they're grouped, you know, according to what Sanskrit manuscript somebody is referred to in like these are the key 4, and it's not always the same 4. So anyway, the characteristic of these texts, which I think I did mention this morning, is that they're celebrating Buddha. They're not deconstructing conventional categories that we grasp onto. They're more praise of Buddha in the sense of the ultimate Buddha, that is our fundamental nature, and praising this in the sense of the being extremely sublime or transcendental reality. So in that way, bearing some possible relationship to the kind of language that or viewpoint that you find in the Sublime Continuum, which I think, I don't know, last year we read a little bit of that together, you know, where it celebrates the ultimate reality as this fundamental Buddha that's within all of us in some sense. And so a little bit different kind of perspective, one could say, than you see in the 6 collections of reasoning. And then there are other texts besides those classed like that, including the commentary, the Gaudiya Samaja commentaries, and then there's a text called the Bodhisambhara, which means the collections so that you amass as you're going to enlightenment. What do we call those? The 2 collections, except it doesn't say 2. The collections that you use to go to awakening. And that text, which I've just read, is very much like a collection of little sayings, and doesn't seem to have much structure that I could discern. It's almost like somebody collected potent Nagarjuna quotes from here and there and put them together, and they have maybe some sort of sense that the focal point is the Bodhisattva and the Bodhisattva's practice on the path, but it's not laid out in a systematic way. And then another text, which I think is cited by Bhaviveka and ascribed to Nagarjuna, is the heart of dependent arising, verses on the heart of dependent arising, which is, as you would expect, a description of the process of dependent arising, and then identifying the very heart of this process of dependent arising as emptiness. Okay. Anyway, yeah. All right. Now let's look at some actual example of some of this, starting on page 61. His Holiness has said that when he teaches the Mulan Madhyamaka Karikas, he likes to start with the 12 links of dependent origination. And it seems that this is because he wants to make something very clear that's sometimes been overlooked. I think in some cases by Western scholars, and maybe in some cases by Tibetan scholars outside Gelugpa, and that is that it seems very clear that Nagarjuna believes in things. He has positions and arguments and theses and particular points that he wants to put forward, such as that things are arising conventionally in dependence on other things, and that cyclic existence works. And he's he has a chapter in the Mula Madhyamaka Karikas, right, where he's just going through that the 12 links of dependent origination and showing how things arise, and so it becomes what do you say? Like you're closing one eye or something like that if you insist that Nagarjuna is all about just refuting things and has no position, has no claim, leaves us in a sort of a blissful, skeptical vacuity or something like that, where we're liberated from having to have any perspective on things at all, or be able to say anything about how things work when we're speaking conventionally, because he himself clearly makes a whole bunch of positive statements, and this is his most negative, in terms of the destructive analytic logic. This is the most negative, persistently negative of his works, right? And yet here he has a chapter sort of laying out, well, this is how things work at the conventional level, that conditioning works, and this is how it works. And I think it makes it people don't, when they're characterizing Nagarjuna in terms of thesislessness, then they'll quote where he says he has no thesis, but they won't quote where he's putting forth these theses. Right? And it's like, well, how do you put these two together? And of course, Tsongkhapa has his own theory about how to put it together, but some people don't seem to even take seriously the fact that there's this material right in here. So anyway, I think that's why he starts there. And another way to put it is like this, that the tradition in Gelugpa has been to educate people in such a way as to focus on giving them confidence in the workings of the Buddhist world, including dependent origination and karma and its effects, and then on the basis of that confidence that things do work conventionally, to bring in the idea that all this works conventionally only because there's no essence. And that's different from an approach in which you said everything you see is wrong. And now, within this spaciousness, let's watch things pop up spontaneously. What do you make of that? See what I'm saying? I mean, no, but it sounds a little flip, but seriously, that could be another way to do it, right? And if you just if we just read the Karikas instead of reading, if we just read from the beginning of this book, and we read, what does Nagarjuna say? Well, it starts out in very there's no arising, there's no ceasing, there's no causation, there's no possibility of going anywhere on any sort of path, and one thing after another seems to be refuted. And then after he's been refuting for a while, he says, oh, by the way, here's how dependent arising works. And that's a little bit more like, you see him the opposite of and His Holiness is starting in the middle, because he wants to give you this sort of start with this confidence in the conventional existence. So this is a matter of you know, how a teacher wants to approach things, and there's a certain sense of what is the greater danger, you know, and for people. And anyway, the general understanding is that Nagarjuna was feeling that, at least in the case of this text, that there were people that he had to attack who were holding on to a sort of a reified Buddhist realists, who were holding on to ideas of certain kinds of categories that were indestructible or sort of fundamental categories to which things boiled down. That there might not be a real person, but there were real aggregates and there were real categories that you could use as the building blocks for that person. And so Nagarjuna is starting from the point of view of taking that apart and then building it into that, his presentation of how even within that deconstruction you still have dependent arising functioning, right? So you're going to take your main, what do you say? Target being somebody who has an extreme of nihilism in the foreground, or an extreme of reification in the foreground, or a danger of that, you know. And the other thing to think about in terms of that is that if you're teaching a lot of people, and they're not all going to be quickly realizing emptiness, that exposing everybody very early to a presentation of emptiness, like in like His Holiness teaching large numbers of people, or like this book, or in the Gelugpa curriculum, where everybody just comes through, and they may or may not have a mind that's suitable for emptiness, but you want to still get them educated about how things work conventionally. It may make sense for like mass distribution, right? To start with things that are the basis for the cultivating of virtue, rather than, here's how you get out of cyclic existence. What do you mean? What's cyclic existence? It's like, I didn't know I was in it, and why is that a problem? Yeah. Okay, so anyway, that's my introduction to that. And so when I picked up at the end of that chapter rather than going through all the end, but just so when ignorance has ceased, actions will not arise. So if you have the 12 links of dependent origination, it's not being posited that you can just readily break in at any point. I think about it as like a Ferris wheel or something like that, and there's like, you can't just get off at 9 o'clock or 12 o'clock or 3 o'clock, you have to get off at 6 o'clock, right? And something like that, there's a weak point. and the weak point is also the in some sense understood as the driving of the whole cycle, is this, as we were talking about this morning, this diluted idea of how things exist. So you have to have something that opposes this ignorance that's the root of all cyclic existence, so as to break the cycle so that actions return will not arise. He hasn't said yet what is going to oppose that, or he hasn't said in this chapter. Ignorance then ceases through insight into meditation. Oh, there we go, the next line. Ignorance ceases through insight into and meditation on suchness. Very often, both in the Sanskrit and in the Tibetan, the word suchness is being used synonymously with emptiness. And I haven't seen anybody really do a good study of this and see if there's anything that can be learned by why one word's used sometimes rather than others. I was trying to watch today because we were talking so much about emptiness, and I mean, it really seems that he uses suchness more than emptiness, but it seems to definitely mean the same thing, as far as I can see. I couldn't see any difference. I mean, anyway, aside from the usage, technically, we're to understand them as meaning the same thing. Suchness is not a good English word, really. But it's difficult to know what to say, ta, things, the ta is like ness, and like that-ness, or such as they are-ness. And I know that Tsongkhapa, Je Rinpoche, from his works that I've read, he does say dongbani, emptiness, sometimes, but he much more often says tekonani, just only thatness, only thatness. And he means the same thing as emptiness as far as I can see, but he just like uses that like much more. And it seems like that's a little bit, at least from what we read here, it seems like there's a common thing there in Nagarjuna too, to say suchness, such as they are, like debate. And so I don't know, sometimes we translate reality. The problem is reality means so many different things. And it's like, is that the good reality or the bad reality that you're superimposing? And then there's other words that you want to translate as reality too. So that's a difficult term. Everybody has problems translating. But it means the quality of things such as they are, unelaborated, unadorned, the naked quality of things just as they are before we mess it up. So sometimes, people think of, this sort of idea of the simplicity, or one Japanese, in some of the other schools they talk about, it's not so much in Gillig, but some of the other schools they talk about simplicity. And this idea is sort of suggesting the idea of things just as they are before you've complexified them with mental elaborations and projections on top of things just as they are. And then I know it's like some Japanese existential Buddhists, right, say, well, we should call it sheer life. Like things just, the world just as it is before you've like added on what you're going to project onto it or elaborate. And so then this turns out to be like the reality of things just as they are is the same as emptiness, is the ultimate nature of things. Okay? It sort of talks about the same thing with different sort of language. So then His Holiness often makes this next point in his commentary here, which I think comes from Dharmakirti, who lived many centuries after Nagarjuna. But he says like that you can't stop ignorance by meditating on love or compassion or generating bodhicitta or by being a good person. You have to have, those are all valuable things that are necessary on the path to liberation. But they're not the actual antidote to the root of cyclic existence. The actual antidote to cyclic existence is that you have to have a wisdom that directly, non-dualistically knows the actual nature of things. And this is what His Holiness is saying here, is that you have to first come to a decisive understanding that this true existence that we're clinging to is utterly non-existent. And then having come to that understanding, cultivating it in meditation, then even when you have it cultivated in meditation and you are able to focus your mind on it, that in itself is being a very profound state on the path, is not the actual antidote. Because, and this is what he's saying here, not in a very condensed way, even wisdom arisen from meditation that's focused on emptiness, that negates true existence, isn't sufficient because it still has a kind of aspect of a certain image of emptiness that you've developed in your mind through analysis, and you're focusing your mind on that. And it's really more like the idea of, meditative penetration, or that you have to like if you cultivate calm abiding, I guess, is that what you say? Calm abiding or serenity, meditative serenity. If you cultivate meditative serenity until your mind is very stable and clear, then you can use very one-pointed and very sharp and very vivid and clear, and so that you have a pliancy, so that you can, serviceability, so that you can put your mind on like a certain object and it will stay as it stays as you wish, with a clear, sharp, one-pointed focus. But if you get these kinds of states of mind, which are very difficult to cultivate, then it's possible to achieve paranormal things. Okay, and you know, and this is all the history of magic and folklore, yogic magic, and in India and Tibet has to do with people who are, may or may not be, you know, have any enlightenment, but they certainly have the power to do some supernormal things by concentrating their mind. Well, one supernormal thing that you could do by concentrating your mind is know directly and come to, you know, penetrate into seeing what the nature of reality is directly and non-dualistically. If you focus your mind one-pointedly on this image of emptiness that you've developed in meditation, initially it's still just an image that you focused your mind one-pointedly on. But through a process of training with that, with, you know, focusing on that, the serenity, because it has this quality of non-discursiveness, that the mind isn't fluctuating, you know, it's not unstable, and also because I think when you're in that state, there's a loss of a sense of a subject-object duality. That's why I use that they have a sense of like penetrating the object, like it's not you over there and me, the object over there and me over here, but you unite with the object, or you have the experience of being non-dualistically experiencing the object. And so when people meditate on emptiness in that way, they advance to this level of nirvana, that is, where they're directly, non-dualistically experiencing the ultimate nature of reality, which they've already realized and been meditating on for a long time. But you know, the object of their meditation had this was in sense an internal or conceptual representation of emptiness, rather than emptiness qua emptiness, emptiness as it actually is. So yeah, it's one thing to understand emptiness, very good, and then another thing to, you know, apply it in reflection to your own experience. That's, you know, harder and rarer, and then be able to develop it in meditation so that you have, you know, a real sense of insight into it, and then focus your mind one-pointedly on that emptiness that you're getting through meditative analysis, and then you progress to the non-dualistic realization. So that's why it takes a while to cultivate the path. Yeah. So anyway, that's why he's saying there that you have to realize this correct ascertainment of emptiness in direct experience. So through the cessation of this and that do not manifest. He's referring to the unwinding, undoing of the whole of the mass of samsara through the breakdown of the links of dependent arising, because you're breaking the, when you realize, when you get to the first ground, or the path of seeing, where you're seeing, in a sense, mentally seeing emptiness directly with your mind, then you stop that process by opposing ignorance completely. Okay, so let's go to 65 and look at the chapter 8. This is His Holiness's commentary on chapter 18. This is a long sort of introduction talking about the general idea of an I, or a self, that self being the topic of this chapter. He said generally other schools, all these different Buddhist schools think that grasping at self-existence is the root of cyclic existence, but they're thinking that this means that people are falsely, or deludedly grasping in a self that's somehow distinct from the mind and body, like a kind of a self that's like a master or controller of the physical and mental components of the person. That's what he says here. Anyway, so the idea of a super self that owns and controls and directs the aggregates. And he gives this little thing from Dharmakirti, which is nice, where he's saying, you can see how it is that we feel this if you do this little thought experiment and think about, like, if I'm getting old and then I could, like, change my body with a healthier, younger body, then he's saying, yeah, anybody can see introspectively that, yeah, I do that. But then, like, well, who would you be then? If you're, and then he's like, well, I would be me, you know. I'd be me with everybody. It's like, so then you think, well, you know, and then the you must not have anything to do with your body. And I guess that's complicated now, because that would include your brain, not all of your organs would be like. So then if you do that with the consciousness, you know, he said you can reach the same conclusion, you know. Say if I could trade my mental capacity for one that was much more kind and more loving and had a better memory and was more mindful, then I would do it. But then that just shows the fact that I think that I could do that, like, means that I don't really think that, you know, that I think that there is an I that could, like, trade off these things, and that it exists, you know. It's like it goes to the aggregate store and picks out, like, which ones that, you know, it might like to, what's the fashion this year, you know, for, you know, it's almost like that, you know. It's like, what qualities are in this year? On page 67, so then he talks about the distinction between the emptiness of self and the emptiness of phenomena. And this is only potentially a little bit confusing, because in Tsongkhapa's own system, he's going to say, and His Holiness would say, that ultimately in our system, the selflessness of a person and the selflessness of phenomena refer to the same emptiness, not anything different, but just with regard to a different base. And so neither of them is, like, subtle or more profound. It's just you're talking in relationship to a person or in relationship to a non-person phenomenon. But here he's speaking about the selflessness, emptiness of self as being coarser, because he's not referring to that profound emptiness of self. He's referring to this, like, lack of the self as the owner or the controller, and he's saying that's not going deep enough. You know, you have to have an emptiness of phenomena that, like, looks at the very basis of things and sees that everything is empty of intrinsic nature. So he's saying to understand to get rid of, or to understand and eradicate fundamental ignorance in its subtlest sense, we have to identify this grasping at intrinsic existence of all phenomena, not just this owner and controller of the aggregate sense. And it's something subtler than the, you know, the feeling that I have about shopping. It's something deeper and subtler than the feeling I have about myself as some real self that can shop for aggregates at the store. That's what he's saying. That's like a coarser level. Okay, so then he makes a nice point. I think that people have, like, always have for a long time been asking the question, who am I? He doesn't. It's interesting. He doesn't say we have always been asking this question of ourselves. He says, well, in India, it's been about 3,000 years since we've started working on this question, which sort of seems about right from, you know, what we know historically, that people maybe as people started living, maybe this isn't true, maybe it's just we started to know about it, but, you know, there's this sense anyway that maybe as people started to live in larger communities where they were more farther separate from their home village, and they didn't necessarily know everybody who was around there, and they had some, they weren't all just subsistence farmers and then a king in the other place, but everybody was doing different crafts and so forth in cities, and that maybe people started to feel more a sense of, like, an individual alienation and the question of, like, well, who am I, rather than who are we, or what are we supposed to do. Anyway, that's what some people have wondered about. it's whatever the reason is, it does seem like people started, it wasn't always the case that in an obvious way, all of the most ancient kinds of, evidence about religion always focused on this question. But then at a certain point, it started to move forward as like an important question. And as he points that out by saying around 3,000 years ago, and maybe if not earlier, people started to ask this question in a significant way. And he says, then as people do, they come to understand that hatred and anger and fear is connected to and arises out of attachment to oneself and to one's family members and one's community, and that you get these violent emotions when things to which we're strongly attached feel threatened, and then that leads to battles and conflicts and so forth. And this isn't something that is unique to Buddhism in itself to discover that. But I think then when people investigate, then he's arguing the sense of who is the person, Buddhism argues that we can't really separate the objects of our attachment or anger or hatred from the person who is having this conception, because there's no natural enemy, or it's like when we talk about good guys and bad guys, it's sort of a joke, right? Because we know that it's all relative to who's looking, and we're very aware of that when we're not in the middle of it. But then when we're in the middle of it, it just seems naturally the case that those people are suitable objects of anger. I feel this anyway. I don't know. Maybe you don't. You're all bodhisattvas here, but I just think when I do feel like when someone can do something to, take something of mine inappropriately, and especially if it's unexpected, no time to prepare the mind or something like that, then you could feel that, that is a bad person, and that were anything bad to befall that person, we'll say Rush, for example. I don't know why I'm thinking of Rush, but if something were to happen to Rush, then it would be we wouldn't want to rejoice in this, but we would see it as suitable, that he was a natural object, a natural basis for misfortune, he's naturally existent as a basis of misfortune. Yes. Yes. And I'm just observing that as a very peaceful, neutral Buddhist over here. Yes. Okay. That's a good example. So anyway, His Holiness makes that point, and let's see. He talks about how, as this inquiry proceeded in India, many people in India came to the conclusion that there must be a real, permanent, eternal self that is the basis of the instinctive or intuitive sense, I am. And this is rather interesting, his discussion about that. He says, everyone says, when I was young, I was like this, and when I was older, I will do that. When I'm older, I'll do that. What do you want to be when you grow up? It's like you will be this, there's a sense that our ordinary language reflects an intuition that there's a permanent person who exists across the continuum of our life, or lives, in this case, life. And that's interesting to me because I'm in a philosophy and religion department, and I've discovered living with philosophers that a lot of what they do, actually, not all of it, but a lot of what they do is they sort of identify intuitions and then try to, deeply held, widely held, shared intuitions. And then they try to develop reasons, a structure of reasons which does justice to our fundamental intuitions. this was something that I didn't know looking at philosophy from the outside, but now being with professional philosophers all the time, I discover that this is actually a very important thing. Not everybody does that, but it's like it's a dominant kind of way of thinking about what philosophy is. And I think that you do find people who pursuing that in Western philosophy, who pursuing that approach, that would be realists about the person, not exactly the way a Vedantin would, saying there's an eternal person forever, but they were saying, yeah, we have to say that there is a real person, because otherwise we're doing violence to our pervasive intuitions that are reflected in these ordinary ways of talking about what are you going to be when you grow up and so forth. And then he also uses the argument for the self that if there wasn't some eternal self, then like how could advanced meditators recall their past lives? He says before the time of the Buddha, there were different views that people had, but the general consensus was that there had to be some sort of eternal, unchanging self or essence of the person that was independent of the mental and physical aggregates. And what he's talking about here is not that that was some reflexive position that they, like me thinking I want to go to the aggregate store and pick out, it's not like that. He's saying this is the philosophical view that people arrived at through that line of inquiry and reasoning. They reached that conclusion. And of course, from a Buddhist point of view, this is just adding more trouble on top of the natural trouble that's already there. Of course, he says, Buddha argues that our intuition of an inborn self is a delusion, and such beliefs are a source for all kinds of further false views. The person so then, if Buddha say we don't have this kind of self, then does that mean that there's no person at all? It will certainly sound like that to, people who are realists about the existence of a self. And they will immediately, and I it's like almost beyond the possibility of being convinced, feel that you're denying the basis for being able to talk about anything. So the Buddha has to, of course, posit that a person exists, and you could even say that a self exists, and that the person, you say I, myself, himself, herself, itself, as a way of referring to things and people, right? As long as you're not, you're understanding that this is something that's merely conventionally existent as a way of referring to how the world flows and interacts, and rather than being some sort of ultimately pin-downable, locatable, graspable thing. And of course the point is that that's how we feel that the self is, and yet that's exactly what we can't find when we search. So the Buddha responds, the person does indeed exist, but exists only in relation to and in dependence upon the mental physical aggregates, and not as some permanent essence that's either one with them or essentially different from them. Let's see. Well, let's then go to page 73 and look at the actual beginning. I'll skip over time and the self for a second. Oh no, maybe I won't. Let's see. Start at the bottom on page 72. So he's talking about like the searching for the present, and he's saying, you can't, when you search instant by instant and divide time into smaller and smaller bits, you can't really like find the present. It's ultimately infinitely receding. I was thinking about it as I'll just share a couple of thoughts that I had about the impermanence and how it relates to emptiness here. Is like, I know the first year I was here, maybe somebody said, when I was talking about emptiness for a long time, and he said, well, really all comes down to impermanence. And I was thinking in my mind, well, no, it doesn't. But then But then there's something very profound about what he was saying too, and how, you know, that if things had some essence, they wouldn't be able to change like this. And also that if you really understand what it means that these things are not just changing instant by instant, or what did you say, every nanosecond by, they're not just changing nanosecond by nanosecond, but faster than that. Because each nanosecond has a beginning, middle, and end, and so forth. And you don't really ever get to the point where you can say, what's the locatable unit, you know, that represents the present moment. So like there is, like where do you, you know, there is a present as long as you don't look too closely, is in a sense. And that's, right, isn't that true? And I think that's something like when I teach my students about impermanence, it's understood as momentariness. And so you have to posit moments, like nanoseconds are good. I haven't actually wheeled that one out, but you know, it's like, right, I think they say I think Buddhaghosa says 1/360th of a finger snap. So, you know, it's like probably a little longer than a nanosecond there. But I mean, it's like, oh, a very short amount of time. But then that still has a beginning, middle, and an end, and everybody can, like, you know, understand that now. And so there isn't really like a place that you can say that things are happening, you know. And His Holiness, this is a point he's making in the middle paragraph of 72, and he says, and this doesn't mean that nothing happens at all, or there isn't such thing as the present whatsoever. The present exists relative to a framework. When you say this present year, you aren't confused because you're talking in relationship to, you know, a broader context of years and so forth. So, you know, if we want to know which nanosecond we're talking about, we have a framework of, you know, seconds, and we know where different nanoseconds fit within the framework. But when we try to, like, pin down the present moment, the present nanosecond, oops, it's already gone. But anyway, it's like, you know, that's the idea. So it's only relative to a certain framework that you can talk about the present time. When you search for it, it's unfindable. So he says, in just this way that you can understand this, you can understand that the existence of the person is within a conventional relative framework. And then he says, without needing to search for some objective, intrinsically real person that is the self. Well, actually, we do need to search for an objectively real person that is the self. But he's saying, if you want to posit things as existing conventionally, then you do not, in that same moment, want to be going around and saying, what is it ultimately? You have to, like, do one or the other. Until you're a Buddha. A Buddha, you can do them both at the same time. Meantime, you got to pick, you know. Do I want to know whether this is a cup or a cat, or do I want to know whether it's empty of inherent existence? Because, you know, it's like two wavelengths or two channels that you get on. The question, what is this really? And then the question is, conventionally within the framework, you know, that we have here, what is it appropriate for me to designate this as, right? And those are like these two different. So that's what he says. Within the conventional relative framework, it's fine to talk about the existence of a person and say that. And then he says, we can maintain our common sense notion of the person or individual in relationship to the physical and mental faculties that comprise our particular existence. And I read that, I thought, well, whose common sense notion would this be? Because I think he's like, what he's saying is that conventional reality works, and that if we would be satisfied with that, actually that's the phrase that they use in some of the Sanskrit texts, is these things provide satisfaction as long as you don't analyze them. and so that's what he's saying, is like these things will work just fine as long as you analyze them. And in that sense, common sense is not contradicted by emptiness. But on the other hand, when common sense is like a common sense intuition that things are, you know, well, of course I could pick a younger body or a better mind or common sense. I think our ordinary sense of things, I don't know, I guess I'm just a little bit worried about the sense of affirming common sense in that sentence of His Holiness, because our common sense of things is very mixed up with all kinds of levels of reification. Like, we're beings right now who can't understand the difference between inherent existence and existence, and we don't perceive the difference between inherent existence and existence. Everything that appears to us to exist appears to exist by way of its own nature, and we reflexively just go along with that. Those kinds of things, I think, get embedded in what we think of as common sense. Like a regular Buddhist example is, the idea that yesterday's mountain in Idaho is the same as today's mountain in Idaho. Well, that's common sense, but it's not the same, right? And you can think about that, and yet it is sort of common sense that it is. So anyway, at the beginning of the 18th chapter, Nagarjuna writes, if the self were the aggregates, it would have arising and disintegration. If it were different from the aggregates, it would not have the characteristics of the aggregates. So this verse is, the basis for a lot of meditation, right? The process of this gets expanded into the argument of refuting the intrinsically existent self by showing that it's not one with or intrinsically different from its basis of designation, and is an important part of the reasoning and meditative tradition going forth in Madhyamaka. Tsongkhapa, in his commentary on this verse in Ocean of Reasoning, starts by talking about identifying the object of negation, which is not, of course, is not here at the beginning. But he's making it clear that he sees this as a reasoning to be applied in meditation and not just by philosophers. And in order to make that clear, he's saying, look, you first have to talk about what is this self and understand what is the self that is being subject to critique here, and find within yourself this sense of an intrinsically real self, a sense of yourself as existing by way of your own nature. And then in regard to that self, examine it as to whether it could possibly be one with the aggregates, or whether that kind of self that exists by way of its own nature could be different from the aggregates. So, various arguments then are given about whether if the self were the aggregates, it would have arising and disintegration. So this aggregates are, changing moment by moment. They're arising and disintegrating moment by moment. Yet people want to think of the self as permanent or eternal, or, as this solid thing in our common sense, like yesterday's mountain, today's mountain. What are you going to be when you grow up? It's not like the idea is that there's a real self that it can at the same time become something else. It's sort of contradictory already, like just in itself, right? There's a real permanent you, but it won't be what you are now. It'll be something different, but it'll still be you. So there's a lot of things like that where there's kind of like a contradiction just built into the way we think of things, but then we don't examine it. And so if the self were the aggregates, it would have to have arising disintegration, because those are the characteristics of the aggregates. The mind is constantly changing. The body, people can notice that their bodies are changing, that their minds are changing, and then it's like, well, if the self is the same as those, then it must be constantly changing, and that isn't the way we thought of it when we tried to identify this intrinsically existent self. Also, of course, if the aggregates are plural, we have a mind and a body, and then we have our mind is different in every moment, and we have lots of different parts of our body, and so you can think about well, if the self is the mind and body, then does that mean that there are two selves, or because there's or five selves because there are five aggregates, or that would be the usual traditional way to think is got five aggregates, you got five selves, right? Because they're the same, as they're one and the same. So there must be one for each aggregate, Or it must be there's only one aggregate, because the self is clearly a unitary thing, and so there must be just one aggregate that makes that up. Since they're identical, that's what he's saying. If it exists by way of its own nature and it's identical to the aggregates, then it really has to have this kind of a complete identity with it in terms of all its characteristics. Can't just be sort of vaguely similar and say that it's the same. And then, what else? Redundancy. You know, that was another argument they gave it. And it's like, well, the self is aggregates. Why do you even talk about? You know, if it is, you already got the aggregates. Why do you need to say self? And people really do need to say it, right? That's interesting. That's just so revealing in and of itself, right? And so then through that kind of analysis, then you bear down and cause to seem implausible within your mind the idea that there could be, that this intrinsically real self could be really the same as the aggregates. So then it must be different than the aggregates. Now, one of the points that His Holiness doesn't bring up here is that, of course, his own view would be that at the conventional level, in some sense, there is a merely conventionally existent person that if you said of that person that merely conventionally exists, would you say that it's conventionally the same as the aggregates or different from the aggregates? It would be different. So then if you don't understand what's actually being talked about here, you could think that the right answer was the second part of this verse, right? That the self is different from the aggregate. So it doesn't have to have all the characteristics of the aggregates, right? But if a self exists by way of intrinsically, as it feels, as something that's permanent, solid, unitary, or then if we go deeper, it's something that exists from its own side by way of its own nature without depending on other things, then and it's different from that. Okay, it exists by way of its own nature without depending on other things. Just has its own thing going there, myself, right? Some people believe that in Hinduism, right? He's talking about earlier, and so then it's different from the mind and body, so it doesn't have to have anything to do with them. Actually, there's no reason for it to be in any way related to them, and I can have myself and it just Tsongkhapa uses the horse and the cow example actually, which I don't know. I always have stayed with. Right? I always like to imagine myself being out in the cow, but my mind and body are completely here and just the same. But you look puzzled. But why not? There's a self, and it exists in and of itself. It doesn't need the mind and body to be the self. It's just the self in and of itself. So it could, go to Venus and leave my mind and body. Actually, I'll posit right now. My mind and body are doing just fine, and I'm sending myself up. I mean, if I had an intrinsically existent self, you wouldn't even know the difference as whether it was here or not. I could attach it to an email and send it off to somewhere. It's like it wouldn't change anything about what's going on. So that seems like not the way we think of this. It has to have it's lurking around in here somewhere. Where is that? And it's like, and obviously this requires further investigation, right? And that's why you have things like Chandrakirti's, sevenfold reasoning and so forth to go into this, explore this very much more deeply and try to track the thing down. So then going on to the next verse, it says, if the self itself does not exist, then how can there be mind? Now here His Holiness gives a straightforward commentary on that, and that is, explaining that if we don't that we won't think mind because to think mind in relationship to various things entails the concept of the self, and if we eradicate or undermine the sense of the self through the former reasoning in the first verse, then this will also analogously undermine the sense that self can be the owner of it, possessor of something. And he, in another context, he talked about this a little bit in terms of how when so that the sense of mind is most directly relevant here to my mind and my body. Actually, that's what he's talking about in the previous verse. So when he says mind, he's not, I mean, we obviously have a lot of minds. But the immediate context is my mind and my body that they're talking about, right? And then that's kind of important, okay, here, philosophically. Because the idea is that many of these other Buddhists who could be reading this, they would say, yeah, you're right, we do have this artificial construction of the self on the basis of the aggregates, which are real, And so he's saying, well, you can't really say that these are my aggregates if there isn't some self to be the owner of the aggregates. His Holiness gave this example about that when you want something and you go to the store and you see it and you have a certain attachment and relationship to it, but then when you buy it, the quality of the mind changes. And then he's talking about that sense of mind, which has now been applied to the self has been a sort of sphere of dominion, has been extended to include the purchased object. It's like, and he's saying, so that's like our aggregates are immediate, the most immediate thing that are within that sphere. And the undermining of the intrinsically existing self, not a substantially existing, but understanding of a deeply, of the deepest sense of self, then means that you have to get at, and undermine also this idea that there's some real mind and body that are the basis of the self. So then he says, next verse, since self and mind are both pacified, one does not grasp at them. This is understood to mean that pacified, I take as meaning that the force of the facts that you've analyzed has been, cultivated in meditation, as mentioned at the end of the previous chapter, into, a state where your on page 61, so that when the self and mind have been analyzed, and then that force of those facts has been an object in which you've stabilized your mind, so that you have insight into that. The force of that understanding is directly opposes the delusion that's the root of cyclic existence. It's like, I don't know, I was going to say oil and water, but that's not good. But yeah, it's like this is an antidote that directly opposes the delusion. It displaces it by logically by knowing the antithesis of what delusion holds implicitly. That's the idea. So then verse 3 says, well, the person who doesn't grasp at I and mine, that one does not exist either. So that means that there's no real yogi, this yogi who has let go of, it's not that someone becomes a real person, right? That you become a real person by, well, no, the thing is that sounds funny when you say it, but I think some people think like that. That we'll find authenticity, like if we become a Buddha, then we'll be more real. Let's be real, man, and get down, and when we get real, then we'll be real. You know what I'm saying? I think people feel like that. I think that's what that verse is about. That's that idea. That's my posit for today. So, when thoughts of I and mine are extinguished with respect to the inner and outer, the process of appropriation ceases, and this having ceased, birth ceases. So he explains inner and outer here as meaning the conception of a self that either exists among or apart from the aggregates. And say if we have this pacification of this through insight, through analysis and stabilizing on the results of the analysis, we have insight that is knows in a profound way the antithesis of our deluded thoughts, then we get to a state in which we'll no longer grasp at objects of enjoyment or turn away from things that we deem unattractive. When he says on page 76. Karma, and then page 77, karma and afflictions having ceased, there's liberation. Karma and afflictions arise from conceptualizations, and these in turn arise from elaboration, and elaboration ceases through emptiness. That's the first time we've had the word emptiness today. Before he had suchness, and then pacification and so forth, but he has actually emptiness. So obviously, karma, he's sort of running backwards. Liberation comes from stopping karma and the afflictions. Karma and afflictions have been arising from conceptualizations. It seems like you're thinking like, it means like that, like something we might think about rush that would be unpleasant. You know, we could have a conceptualization of rush. And then that would be on the basis of our having apprehended it, you know, rush as an inherently suitable. That's what it means by elaboration. When we see him as something inherently suitable as a basis of misfortune, then we form the conceptualization that he would be a good person to have something bad happen to, and then that leads to karma and the afflictions, right? So that, I think what His Holiness explains elaboration here quite a bit. This is a word that gives rise to a lot of different interpretations, as he explains in Tibetan Buddhism. But he explains it here as conceptual elaborations, refers to the mind that grasps at the inherent existence of phenomena. The not leaving things simple or naked or just as they are in their just as they are-ness, but spinning off and elaborating something additional on top of that. That's the sense of it. So it has a quality of adding on, right? And what is being actually elaborated here is onto the ontological nature of the thing. You have it. That's the point, and sort of seeing. It's like, well, but a natural basis of harm. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like that thing. Just that's the problem. So, yeah, seeing somebody as from their own side, just naturally worthy suitable to have something bad happen to them. And then that's an exaggeration or a distortion in terms of how the thing exists. Yeah. Yeah. And that, I think that's how I understand elaboration. Some people seem to think in Tibetan Buddhism, that I've been doing different schools, that elaboration does mean this, but that it goes along with the idea of really any thought or any view that you might hold is regarded as an elaboration. And of course, that's not what Tsongkhapa thinks. And so His Holiness's commentary here is very much in line with the Gelugpa way of explaining it. Okay, so then page 80, verse 6, that there is self has been stated, that there is no self has also been presented. The Buddhas have taught that neither self nor no self exists. And I guess you read this as well as I can. His Holiness gives two explanations. The first is the self represents some reified self of a non-Buddhist school, whereas the second line about that no self having been presented refers to the materialist, or some people call hedonist. Anyway, their name was the Charvaka school, which was sort of represented the nihilistic extreme in terms of Buddhism. And then the Buddhas have taught that neither self nor no self. In other words, their teaching of no self, self or no self, is representing the middle way between people who attribute too little substance to the person philosophically versus people who attribute too much. And then the alternative reading that he gives is that that self has been stated refers to sutras in which Buddha, as I mentioned this morning, teaches about a person who bears or takes up the aggregates or bears the carries the aggregates, and that seems to be for the benefit of people who need to believe in karma and rebirth and are not really to hear about a kind of teaching of selflessness, and that there's no self has been presented. He says, refers to the gross no self of the lower schools. He gives an example of a mind-only view, and he's saying that these things have he implies that these things have a kind of emptiness, but they also have something that they still reify, that they have a reified no self in effect, is what he's arguing. And and then in the end he says, Buddha not only rejects the intrinsic nature of the person, therefore teaching no self, but he at the same time rejects any intrinsic or absolute existence of selflessness itself. And that's what he takes as the last two lines. The Buddhas have taught, in this interpretation, the Buddhas have taught that neither self nor no self exists. That is, there isn't any inherently existent no self. There isn't any inherently existent self. There isn't any inherently existent no self. Yeah, that's of course a very important point, and Nagarjuna, I don't know whether that's exactly what Nagarjuna meant in this line, but it's very clear that by the end of, in the 24th chapter, he absolutely does make this very clear, that emptiness itself is not to be, grasped onto as something that is the one inherently real thing. Emptiness exists only interdependently, just like everything else. And actually, of course, that's a very profound and important thing that really becomes, if you don't have that, then Buddhism is just sort of like monism, in which you've given a negative label to the monistic reality. Don't you think? I mean, anyway, that's my thought. Maybe it's not exactly, but it's sort of like that anyway. 18.6. And then 18.7, Nagarjuna goes on. What language expresses is undone, because the object of mind is undone. Unborn and unceased, like nirvana, this is the suchness of things. And I don't know, I thought this is interesting in terms of the idea that here, just in terms of what we were talking about a little bit this morning with nirvana, and as being a pacification of birth and cessation, but whether that can really be identified with, in some way, with the actual nature of things. And he's saying that this something that transcends any kind of capacity to be taken as an object by the ordinary mind or by language, something that's unborn and unceased, like nirvana, that this is the actual nature of things as they are. So of course, we would say that, he didn't use the word emptiness, but he's talking about emptiness, and he's saying, this basic nature of things is something that we can't really express it in ordinary language, just the way it is. That is something that he says, it seems to be saying here, like nirvana, that this is the fundamental reality of things. So it's interesting, he doesn't exactly say that emptiness is nirvana, but he seems to be saying that the fundamental reality of things is like nirvana, this something that transcends any conceptual thought. So just in terms of what I was talking about this morning, I thought this is like, okay, here's where they're saying that there's this nirvana-like reality is the basic nature. Emptiness, nirvana-like reality that's quiescent and pacified, is the nature of tables and chairs and books and things like that. Instead of saying, all this stuff is dependent arising, and it's kind of dicey because it's all contaminated with the afflictions. Let's get out of here and go to the uncontaminated, unconditioned realm. You know what I'm saying? Nirvana's cool. This place is burning hot. Those are two different characters. Let's get at, characteristics. Seeing the bad characteristic here, let's bug for the other place. There's two places, right? And here he's sort of saying, wow, this unconditioned, fundamentally peaceful, unarisen, unceasing nature of things, that's actually what the very fundamental reality of these things. You see what I'm saying? I think it's kind of a profound verse, and especially I see it that way in light of the conversation this morning. But anyway, His Holiness has a different point to make here from what I was saying, which is to do with what kind of negation emptiness is. And this is a very big debate, within Tibetan Buddhism, and there's the idea of an implicative or a not. I kind of am gone with Jimba's, implicative and non-implicative negations. Jeffrey has affirming negative and non-affirming negative. Affirming negative, well, anyway, neither one of them is literal. You can't really translate it literally. It literally would be an is not negation or a doesn't exist negation. That's just completely unhelpful. So it means like a negation that leaves something that is implied in the place of that which has been negated, or that which is a sheer negation. Obviously, sheer negation, it could be good for the non-implicative one. The problem being that then you don't have what's the opposite as an unsheer negation. It sort of doesn't really work. You could say an implicative negation and a sheer negation. Non-implicative is kind of awkward, I don't think. Anyway, that's the idea. So which kind of negation is emptiness? Is emptiness a sheer negation that doesn't imply anything else in the place of what's been negated, or is it an implicative negation that implies something else in the place of what's been negated? I always think, well, I don't know. One way, if you don't know the right answer, and you just think about I'm contaminated by knowing having the answers, but it's like if I think about it, it's like, well, it's this whole thing about dependent arising and emptiness, and it's like they mean the same thing, and dependent arising doesn't sound like any kind of negation, and if they mean the same thing, and one implies the other, then wouldn't emptiness sort of imply something else in the place of what had been negated, which is that things are arising in a merely dependent way, and that's something that's been implied. But that's not the right answer. No, not at all. No, the answer is that emptiness is a sheer negation in Gelugpa. And His Holiness doesn't always hew to the strict party line in everything he writes about this, but in this book he absolutely does. And he emphasizes how very important this is to understand that emptiness is a sheer negation, a non-implicative negation, a simple, decisive negation that leaves nothing to grasp at. That's his point, is that it can't be with some trace or residue, that we negate a certain kind of self, but we leave that there's something that's left behind. He wants a total negation that utterly eliminates is the complete negation of that which does not exist. Now that doesn't mean that something else couldn't exist, right? But it's not, the term itself is not supposed to be like, implying or requiring or demanding something else to exist. That's the idea. Why this is an issue that comes up a lot is because, well, there's a lot of reasons. He gives one that has to do with debating. from India. But the other reason that becomes important in Tibetan Buddhism is because of the idea that, you know, when you realize emptiness, that's like, it's not, emptiness isn't just realized by a robot or a computer or in the abstract. It's dependent upon a mind to realize it. It's not, you know, realized independent of a realizer, because it doesn't exist in and of itself. And so, you know, when emptiness is being realized, there's always a very pure, non-dualist, well, you know, in the case of direct realization, you have a very pure, non-dualistic kind of mind that's right there with the emptiness, and from within that experience, there's no sense of here's the mind and here's the emptiness. Very important. So, you know, who says that there's no mind, that there's no positive thing that's implied? Some guy standing over here on the side looking at the yogi saying, well, there's the yogi's mind and there's the yogi's object of realization. But in the yogi's experience, there's like, it's not like that, right? And so that being the case, then people will say in other schools that like this, a certain kind of mind, say a mind vajra, or, you know, something of different words, you know, for this is a kind of fundamental mind which is pure and is in touch with the ultimate reality, and they'll talk about that as the ultimate, right? And this is also the case in some tantric presentations as well. And so, you know, instead of saying the ultimate reality is a sheer negation, they'll talk about the ultimate reality in terms of the mind and the ultimate reality that it's knowing, non-dualistically being together. But anyway, that's not the way that it's done in terms of the Gelugpa presentation of Madhyamaka. And that's not, and His Holiness follows that party line definitely here. And I don't know what to say more about that, but personally for me, I've always been for a very long time very much a party line person with that. Until recently, I've gotten a little soft in my old age, older age. But yeah, it seems to me like very problematic to say about any mind that it is the ultimate reality, because it's a conditioned phenomenon, you know, and even if it's a very pure one, it's not of what I would think of as like the actual fundamental nature of phenomena. It's a particular phenomenon, and so then that's the party line, and that's why I've always felt that like when people say this, that they're making an error, and that it goes in the direction of having some affirmative, graspable thing that you're now going to take as, you know, the Buddhist ultimate reality. And then how would it really be Buddhist anymore? You know, that, anyway, that's my basic concern, which I haven't completely let go of. But then you do have, then I explained the other way of thinking about it before. I mean, it's only a conceptual, we have to work with concepts and where we are now. So I think that when you frame a philosophy in terms of concepts, you should say that emptiness is a non-affirming negative. But you shouldn't say it in a dogmatic way, because you should remember that people who are more farther on the path than you are having experiences of this rather than talking about it, don't experience it in a way that fits with the way you're saying. But then if you try to make a philosophy based on what they're experiencing, it doesn't like make very much sense. You see what I'm saying? So you have to make yeah, that's the way I think. It's two different things. And they're both, you know, helpful sorts of speech, but then in my sense, one shouldn't mix them up. I like it that, you know, the Gelugpas make all these really clear distinctions, and then maybe if you talk to somebody, you know, in the right day, the right person on the right day, they'll say to you, well, you know, it's not really like that when you're meditating, you know. But it's like, it's not going to be in the book. The book will tell you the way you're supposed to think about it. And it's very important, right, to do it that way. Right? So 8 is, His Holiness takes as, at the top of 86, as essentially saying the same thing before, but now using the word real instead of self. And he doesn't say too much more about that. Not knowable from another, tranquil, not fabricated by mental elaboration, devoid of conceptualization, and not differentiated. This is the character of suchness. Yeah. His Holiness says, suchness exists in the manner of a single taste. I think that's what his gloss on not differentiated. It's important to understand that this does not mean that the suchness of all phenomena exists as one. Each and every phenomenon has its suchness, just as all phenomena share the nature of being intrinsic existence. This is an interesting problem. You know, everything has exactly the same taste in that everything is equally equally empty and completely empty of any intrinsic nature. So, if you're tuned into that wavelength, it just sort of opens up, right, in a sense, so that there's not different things that you bump into with distinct characteristics, like that's the blue area of emptiness and that's the semi-empty area of emptiness. It's nothing like that, right? It's just like all empty all the time radio is like goes in like this. It's like no all things considered. When you consider all things on the emptiness channel, it's just the same all the time. Each thing that's considered. I heard that one before, you know, and so forth like that. And so it could be that people would think of emptiness as one then, okay? And His Holiness is saying that one shouldn't think like that. But when it says, when Nagarjuna says, suchness is not differentiated, you shouldn't think that you have to understand that it's one taste, like I just described, and not mean that you can't talk about the difference. That you can't make you can, to put it there, instead of a double negative, just say, he's saying that you can make a distinction, and properly, the conventional level have to say that the emptiness of the book and the emptiness of the cup are distinct phenomena. They are not the same identical phenomena. Their mode of what, you know, this is the same, this emptiness is here and emptiness is here, is in both cases emptiness of inherent existence. Like if you had, you know, two white pieces of paper, each of them is white, you know, or if you have two well-tuned guitars, each of them is melodious, right? But it's still like this is the quality of this one and this is the quality of that one. And that's, in that way, he's saying that there's emptiness of this and emptiness of this and emptiness of that and emptiness of the other thing. So you have an infinite number of emptinesses with regard to every like basis of, that you could point at. You know, the first, what is it called? Nanosecond. The first nanosecond, second nanosecond. All these nanoseconds have like their own distinct emptiness, right? You know, in the one way, that kind of seems like a little silly, since what's been gained philosophically by dividing emptiness up into an infinite number of parts when all these parts taste exactly the same. You might as well just go with the unitary emptiness field idea, right? And His Holiness doesn't like really say exactly why, but he's telling you not to do that. And it is true that in Gelugpa that you know, in Tsongkhapa and in the Gelugpa textbooks that follow, you know, they don't want to say there is an emptiness. and it pops up here and it pops up there. They really want to avoid that. They want you to think about each phenomena and its fundamental nature and then arrive at its nature being characterized by this lack of inherent existence, but not think that there's just this one thing that's the reality, behind all the... so, I don't know. I'll tell you my idea about why this is important, which is that the emptiness of emptiness is, this, as we were talking about earlier, is sort of crucial to emptiness not being turned into a monism. And if there's only one emptiness, right, then emptiness can't really be empty, because that would be a further, when you say emptiness of emptiness, you're taking emptiness as the basis of emptiness instead of the book. Do you see what I'm saying? It's a meta emptiness in a sense, but it's not, but that's the idea. So you have to be able to think of, for each and every phenomenon, there is a way that it conventionally exists, and a question of like what we come to when we ask of that phenomenon, what is it really? And that, when I say for each and every phenomenon, there has to be how it exists conventionally, and then what you come to when you ask what it is really. I'm including emptiness among the phenomenon that you have to be able to ask that about. And if you think about it that way, that's why having a plurality of emptinesses and not wanting to let all the emptinesses from a philosophical point of view just utterly smoosh into one big field, that allows you to avoid this idea that there's like this single absolute reality. And anyway, I just think that, personally, I think that's beautiful. I mean, this is the kind of thing that like makes me feel that I found something, something of special value in Buddhist philosophy. Okay, so let's see. Whatever comes into being in dependence on another is not identical with that thing, and since it is not different from that thing either, it is neither non-existent nor permanent. So it's interesting, as in Nagarjuna, he has these reasonings that become this basis of lots of discussions later on, and he just sort of throws them off as one-liner. So things that had come into being in dependence on another is not identical with that thing, and is not different from that thing either. So you have the idea of what's the relationship between the cause and effect. We had the 12 links of dependent arising. Obviously, there's some way in which some things are arising in dependence on other things. So do they arise in dependence on things that they're the same as, or in dependence on things that they're, and he says, do they arise in dependence on things they're identical with, or things that they're different from? And of course, this leads to all kinds of problems either way that you posit it. His Holiness does it like this. He just says, what's the relationship between a seed and a sprout? It's like, if you actually watch, it's very mysterious. Go back every day and it's like, well, what is that? Was that a seed or a sprout? And it's like, well, really a seed, but there's like this little tiny thing starting to come out. It's not quite what most people would call a sprout, but it's like that seed is funny looking now, it's got a little... So, what's the relationship between a seed and a sprout? Nagarjuna says the effect cannot be identical with its cause. For were that so, the notion of causation would be absurd, because the cause and effect would be the same thing. It's like, if they're both there together at the same time, then how can one thing be causing the other one? Neither could the effect be intrinsically independent from the cause, for were that so, we could not account for the obvious relationship between the cause and the effect, as, for example, a seed and a sprout. So we could have a seed, and since it has an independent reality apart from the sprout, it could produce fire instead of a sprout. Or this example is like lighting a match and the room fills with darkness and so forth. If there's no relation, if these things are independent, so that's one kind of analysis that you can do. And then The other is about how things line up in time. So you can't have them be if they're the same, then they're if they touch, if they're overlapping, right, then they're right together, and you can't have cause and effect. But then if they're different, so they're separated in time, then how does the effectiveness of the cause get over to the effect and make it come about? And it's like, well, you must have, some way of pushing through plasma, or, emptiness, through emptiness. Or then maybe there's some medium in between here, because they can't be together, because then they would become the same at that moment where they touch. They have to be apart. Well, when they're apart, how does the effectiveness, the cause, get over to generate the effect that it can't actually contact and follow? And so you could posit something in the middle, but then you have the same problem again with the relationship between those things. And so you get these kinds of analysis that raise questions about, like, you say it's not that causation and conditioning aren't happening, but when they're happening in a way that's mysterious relative to how we thought they worked, because when you analyze them, they don't actually turn out to be like that there's some real cause that you can find that has some nature that's the same as or different than the effect. And then, of course, Nagarjuna is going to end up arguing later. I don't know how much time I have. I have more time, so a little bit more. So he's arguing that that's great that you can't, because that's the only way anything would ever work at all. But he hasn't quite gotten there yet. By the Buddhas, the saviors of the world, this immortal truth has been taught. Not one, not differentiated, not non-existent, not permanent. Stanson cautions us to be totally free from all conceptual elaborations or extremes. When the fully awakened ones do not appear, and even the Shravakas have disappeared, the wisdom of the self-enlightened ones will arise completely without reliance on others. So he's like teaching a little Mahayana Buddhism suddenly here at the end of the chapter. So the Shravakas, I don't know, you guys understand this, right? The Shravakas refer to the people who are the hearers. That's what Shravakas means. And the Pratyeka Buddhas, Thupten Jinpa translated as the self-enlightened ones, people who are becoming arhats without relying on Buddha's teaching in their last lifetime, and but they're not becoming Buddhas. And then okay, well, anyway, those are the high points of chapter 18. And so then let's just, I don't know, we have like 14 minutes. But we also have a question session tomorrow afternoon. Now, there were a couple of people who had questions at lunchtime. Is there some people who would like to ask a question or two now, or should I start? Yes. Okay, let's do that. Yes.
Do it make any sense to ask if the food and sprout example can be applied to samsara and nirvana, the process of food and the overlapping things?
Does it make any sense? Well, they're not thinking of nirvana as an effect that arises from the condition of samsara at all. That's a good point. Nirvana is like this cycle of conditioning where we're trapped in, and nirvana is being described as a sort of a fundamental condition of peace that's is outside of that cycle of conditioning. So you can't think of nirvana as and in here Nagarjuna does seem to be relating nirvana to the ultimate reality, comparing it to the fundamental suchness of things. So the idea, he's talking about is things in their basic nature, in their fundamental nature, they don't have any graspable reality. Yet we're caught in this cycle of conditioning, within cyclic existence because we're grasping at some reality that isn't there. So you could say that if we put the right causes and conditions into place, which would be an antidote to this grasping, right, then we're activating the process of becoming free from this delusion. And you could say that's like a way of progressing on the path. So then one could get to, in that way, a state of mind that's very compassionate and very wise and seeing into the nature of things, which is, as we're saying, this fundamentally pure of any intrinsic nature or any intrinsic affliction. However, this isn't refuted by the reasoning of the sprout and the seed. Just as we use this argument, isn't intended to show that seeds don't sprout. It's intended to show that when we think about that, our way of imagining what's there and how it's working is diluted. Actually, seeds do sprout, and in that way, you could say we can progress along the path, right? And so we can attain a mental state that's attuned to this fundamentally peaceful nature of reality, right? And but we don't attain it by grasping onto real causes and ourselves as real agents who are really progressing toward it, right? And that's what actually the perfection of wisdom. Oh, we just chanted that this morning, right? In Heart Sutra. They say, the bodhisattvas have no attainment, and that's how they proceed along the path. And it's like, well, this doesn't make any sense unless you're looking at it in terms of this kind of explanation. There isn't any real bodhisattva or real attainment or really any inherently existent causes, for anything, including awakening, right? And that's why it can happen. That's what they're saying, is because because the kinds of causes that work are, for changing our minds, don't have some intrinsic nature that would get locked up in that kind of critique. Is that helpful? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yes?
I'm kind of stuck on the one thing.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
The Venerable talked about it when she's been talking about the bodhisattva passing around. She said something about the emptiness of an ordinary being's mind. Affliction is different than Arya Bodhisattva's mind without affliction. So I'm looking
How is it? I mean, it's different. Okay.
Well, it was part of the teaching that kind of brought up a whole bunch of thinking on all of our parts. But I'm looking at the book and the cup, saying somewhat that the emptiness of the book, you said, is different than the emptiness of the cup because the basic designation of that emptiness is different.
That's the only thing that's different. And that's the same thing with the other example. That must have been what she meant, because there isn't anything else that makes any sense, right?
But within that book, the book is changing moment by moment. Does that mean that the emptiness of permanent phenomena is also different for each of those moments of changing of that book?
Emptiness of which permanent phenomenon?
The book is changing moment
Yeah.
by moment, so
Sure.
is its emptiness also changing?
Oh, is its emptiness changing moment by moment?
Which is saying the same thing about the mind of an ordinary being with its afflictions is different, but within the context of the ordinary mind, which is changing moment by moment, is the emptiness different?
I would say that I just have to say something, right? So I'll say that there's not like an emptiness that's there changing, but that there is a distinct emptiness associated with each phenomenon you point to. I'm going to say that there's not a continuum of momentarily changing emptiness that's like flowing along here with the book, but rather the book is a conditioned phenomena that's changing moment by moment, and as we think or point at or interrogate how this particular moment of the book is like, we find something that tastes like emptiness, and if we pick any other moment, we again find something that tastes like emptiness in relationship to a distinct basis of designation, but that you can't talk about some substratum of emptiness that's momentarily changing instant by instant.
So there's no arising and ceasing of an emptiness
No.
in each moment?
No. No.
But the emptiness of moment one and the emptiness of moment two are different emptinesses, conceptually.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's right. Well, conceptually. Right, and in other words, they're equally, they're of the same flavor, which ontologically they're not differentiated. But again, they're differentiated in relationship to the basis of emptiness, which is a distinct moment of you know, this or that conditioned phenomenon.
So the one case refers to the ultimate nature of emptiness, not its conventional.
No, I wouldn't say that.
No, that was the question. It wasn't a statement.
Yeah, I would say, okay, I would say, no. I mean, emptiness is the ultimate reality, and so its conventional nature is to be the ultimate truth. Conventionally, emptiness is the ultimate truth. Ultimately, it isn't the ultimate truth. I don't never heard anybody say that, but nothing is anything ultimately. So conventionally, emptiness is the ultimate truth. That's the way we talk. And it's designated as the ultimate truth on the basis of it being that which we arrive at when we ask the question of any phenomenon, what is it really? We arrive at emptiness as the unfindability of that intrinsic nature, and on that basis we designate that absence of inherent existence as the ultimate truth. But it's not ultimately the ultimate truth, that's the conventional designation.
So just maybe describe once again, what does one taste refer to then?
It refers to the taste is the taste of absence of inherent existence, the taste of emptiness, and that is, you're talking about an what do they say, a ontological or a way of being, a way that things are. It's not like some things are like this and some things are like that. Like I'd like the example that I was trying to give. It's not very good, but like you have a lot of suppose you have a lot of medicine Buddhas or a lot of green Taras or something, and they're all green. The greenness of each green Tara tastes the same as the other one, but then it's not like that's exactly the same, but because it's the greenness of that Tara, but it still tastes the same, green.
I think,
Yeah, go ahead, jump in, because she doesn't. She's still a little. Yeah.
That from the point of view of conception, the emptiness of the cup and the emptiness of the cat are different. But from the point of view of the yogi realizing the emptiness directly, both of those are exactly the same. Can't be differentiated.
Can't be differentiated. Yeah, like from when you talk in a Gelugpa way, yogis have a lot of impairments because there's all these distinctions that are really important to us, and are really fundamental to like the way reasoning in the system works, and they're oblivious to them.
And so that's true for each moment at the table too. It's only a concept for us to conceive a moment at the table distinctly from a different moment at the table. Therefore,
We're talking about moments at the table is
And
different than,
emptiness is-
and talking about moments of emptiness is different.
Yeah, exactly, but it's the same answer. The emptiness, the cup emptiness is different from the cat emptiness because the concepts are different. And it's the concept
Because
of one moment.
the basis of designations are different.
Right. But
And
one
we're
moment of
talking-
the table and a different moment of the table are actually two different bases of designation also.
That's
What I'm trying to affirm.
Yeah.
That's
Right. That's right.
One of table.
They're two distinct bases of designation,
Right.
even though they're both.
Even though they're both tables.
Yeah,
And they're both
exactly.
divided conceptually.
Right.
Because don't they have different dependent arisings? Like that's why.
Yeah. Yeah. They have different dependent arisings, and so yeah, you at the conventional level, these are they're different things, and that's why at the beginning of the Heart Saved Right, Buddha's meditating on the diversity of I forget how you say diversity of phenomena, all these different phenomena in the world. There's lots of different phenomena in the world at the conventional level. And so in regard to each of them, when you go around and say, what is this really, what is that really, what is that really, you always come to the emptiness of that thing, or emptiness. But it's the emptiness that you found in relationship to that, analyzing the character of that distinct phenomenon. Yeah. Yes?
I was a little unclear when you talked about, you were saying fear negation, and you were saying that there's a problem where a yogi who's directly experiencing emptiness might say, it's not quite like that, and you
Yeah.
down out of the mind, realizing it.
Yeah. This is the problem for me of trying to explain Gelupa and then raise my own qualms about it at the same time. I should be, it's like, I guess I have to, I don't know. Anyway, so what is the thing? A yogi, when we think about emptiness and when we think about a mind, these are two distinct phenomena. One is a conventional phenomena and one is an ultimate phenomenon. Why? Because emptiness, any emptiness, emptiness of the mind or emptiness of the book, is an ultimate reality. Why is it an ultimate reality? Because it's a reality that you arrive, not because it exists in itself, because it doesn't. No, because it's a reality or a truth that you arrive at when you ask the question, what is this really with regard to some basis of investigation? All right? So it's an ultimate reality. Well, the mind is not. Any mind, even a yogi's mind, is not like when you say, what is the cup really, you don't come to the yogi's mind. When you say, what is the yogi's mind really, it would seem you would not come to the yogi's mind, or if you did, that yogi's mind would be essentially existent. And then instead of talking about emptiness, we'd be talking about yogi's mind. Do you know what I'm saying? As the fundamental nature of reality. So minds are conventional phenomena, any minds, right? And so therefore, we don't want to posit them as part of the ultimate nature, any state of mind, any state of consciousness, even if it's very sublime. We don't want to posit that as the ultimate reality in Madhyamaka. And then this is the way we make distinctions properly so that we can think clearly. Okay? You just say the word, think clearly. That's what we're doing. We have to. It's like this is the whole thing in Gelupa. You have to analyze and refute the self and then meditate on that basis. You can't say, well, yogis don't make that distinction, so why should I? No, it's not like that. You have to make the distinctions that allow you to properly understand and refute this exaggerated sense of how things exist, and then work toward a non-conceptual understanding on that basis. That's why it's potentially harmful for me to engage in that sort of, self-questioning, because I don't want to mislead people about that. That's why it's really important in this. I mean, the value of the Gelupa system is that it's attuned to the kinds of minds that we have, rather than trying to build a philosophy around some yogis whose experience is completely different from ours, or some awakened beings whose experience is utterly inconceivable to us. You know what I'm saying? And that's, in effect, that's what, Nyingma is more in terms of the way people talk, right? And not pervasively, because, we know, like Mipam, for example, we showed last year, is able to switch levels. But some people, like, who are very powerful and important, Nyingma teachers, like Longchenpa, it's like there's very much a kind of poetic evocation of the experience of, the awakened mind, in which everything is non-dual. If we can somehow tune into that wavelength without having to do all this, conceptual analysis, then, maybe we would bypass this difficulty, right? But the Gelugpa idea is that this is impossible, that you can't just like stop having conceptual thoughts and therefore be free. You have to have the correct conceptual thoughts, and on then that basis pacify your conceptions. And then, so in other words, it's not just stopping conceptual thoughts, it's like having, that there's some content to non-dualistic. Non-dualistic wisdom is not just non-dualistic, it's also wisdom. So what is it wise about? And if we don't even understand that, then we're not going to have any non-dualistic insight into it. All right? So that's the pro-Gelugpa point of view. I think, is that what you wanted, or did you want me to give the other side again? The other side? Yeah, the other side is like, well, it is like, this is describing it from the point of view of deluded beings. And if you want to know, like, what it's really like in a yogi's experience, which is in some sense is higher, and more in tune with the actual way things are than ours, in that person's experience, when they're realizing emptiness, there's no sense of their mind as being in any way differentiated from emptiness, right? And so that the mind and the emptiness are there together. Even Gelugpa says that as well. It's just that they don't take that as the basis of their philosophy, right? They don't say, and therefore we posit this sublime pure mind as the fundamental truth, or something like that. But some other systems would say, yeah, we have in some ways our minds right now, we have minds right now that are fundamentally pure, in the sense that they have no intrinsically existent afflictions, right? And they have the capacity for manifesting that fundamental purity. So we could talk about that as that mind, that fundamental, you're going to say, is it that mind, or is it the emptiness of the mind that's the fundamental purity? Do you know what I'm saying? And then you start getting those two mixed up, and it's like, if you're talking about the mind as the fundamental reality, that there's a mind that's the ultimate reality of the person right now, then you're definitely going into positing a conditioned phenomenon as, the ultimate reality instead of emptiness. Yes.
So is this, so, I think it has two questions that really get my question out. The first one is, then does the yogi or people who talk about it say that it is a affirming negation?
Yeah, sometimes they say that's why I got started on all this. Yeah, exactly. People argue about that. Well, to the extent that they talk about it, they don't always use that terminology, but that's implicitly what they're saying. And Gelugpas hear them saying that, and they're saying, "You guys don't have it," and they're saying, "You don't know what you're talking about. You're just debating all the time. Go up into the cave and then tell us, and so forth like that." So. Except they don't even say it that nicely.
Same language. It almost seems like, the point gets lost with what you just said about just the mind, and then there's the influence of the mind at that point. I think it gets lost. The language is don't seem to.
Right. Exactly. All right. Yeah, you have to, I was like telling you, we have to read the last talk in the back of Kindness, Clarity, and Insight. Yeah, until it doesn't make any sense the first couple times, but after a while you begin to see what he's doing. Yeah. Okay, is that it for now? Okay, thank you.